Hey guys, welcome. Today we're going to discuss the three main considerations you should have before you buy your first motorcycle. Let's get started. The three main considerations before buying your first motorcycle are going to come down to the rider themselves and personal preference. We'll also have to consider the location and the style of riding that they will most likely be doing on a daily basis or whenever they'll be riding, and the overall physicality of the rider themselves. But when you're looking at your first motorcycle, the first thing you really want to take a look at is what type of bike you actually want. Now, all the different motorcycles all have a purpose. They all have different things that they're going to be good at and other things that they're going to be not so great at. To start off, we'll look at the cruisers. Cruisers are going to be very comfortable to kind of putt around town. They're approachable. They don't have a ton of high-end power, but they do have the torque to kind of get you started at a red light. Once it turns green, that initial power will be fine. The downside of a cruiser is going to be in the weight of the cruiser themselves, as well as potentially the riding position. For me, cruisers feel very uncomfortable in the way that you sit. For others, they believe that it's super comfortable. It just doesn't make me feel confident in it when I'm actually riding it. The other aspect of the weight will be that on highways, it's going to be super comfortable when you're just kind of cruising around. You're not going to get blown all over the place. But on the downside of the weight is that if you're just going around town, going to and from the store and things like that, that weight's going to be a little bit tiring, and it's also a little bit less nimble in terms of being able to maneuver through traffic. The next option to look at, kind of on par with a cruiser, is going to be a touring bike. Now, these are going to be very similar, except that they generally have larger fairings and a few other amenities that generally make them more comfortable for long periods of riding. Not necessarily something I would recommend starting on. They're just a little bit too big, bulky, and don't overly handle too well, unless you're willing to go through a whole lot of different instructional courses and things like that to learn how to actually handle that bike appropriately. The next option is going to be sport touring. Now, this is going to be a cross between a sport bike and a touring bike themselves. It's going to be a little bit more aggressive than your traditional touring bike, and thus a little less comfortable on those long rides. However, you could still take this bike out for an entire day, weekend, and be plenty comfortable riding this bike for long periods of time. Sport touring bikes, I personally think, make pretty solid bikes for beginners. The only downside is that, generally speaking, they have a little bit higher seat height than some of the other options. The next option on the list is going to be a naked bike. A naked bike is generally very similar to a sport bike, other than the fact that the gearing is switched up a little bit shorter to make acceleration a little bit higher, but it usually lowers the top end. There's also no fairings, so you're going to get blasted with the wind while you're riding. Naked bikes are also very maneuverable. They have a little more upright seated position and therefore are much more approachable for a newer rider. We also have dual sport and adventure bikes. Dual sport and adventures are generally great if you're the type of person that has the ability to hop on and off road at a regular basis. I can't personally speak much to this because I personally have never actually even ridden one. I've seen them in the shops, and what I will say is that if you're a shorter rider, they're not really up your alley. They're generally a much higher seat height. However, they're generally pretty comfortable as well, similar to a sport touring bike from what I hear. Another option for motorcycles will be the Supermoto. So these are just basically dirt bikes that are outfitted to have a headlight, turn signals, and road tires on them. They're designed for kind of that rowdier style. If you're really into the stunt rides, or you really think you want to do more parking lot style riding with wheelies and different type of stunts, that would absolutely be something I would recommend. Next option is going to be the Super Sport bikes. Now, Super Sport, the downside of them is that they're going to be a little bit less comfortable to ride for long periods of time, and generally speaking, that pitched forward position that they put you in, new riders tend to find it a little bit uncomfortable when attempting to learn low speed maneuvers. I can say that after having come from sport touring to a super sport, the difference in counter steering and how it feels when you're actually riding the bike is pretty drastic when you switch from one to the other. And I have to say that the sport touring bike, as far as learning goes, was a lot more approachable. So, in terms of the considerations you should have, a lot of it boils down to personal confidence, what you really believe that you're confident in stepping onto and riding. In America, we don't have restrictions as far as what CC you can begin with, and thus you could start on the biggest bike you possibly can. To say that I normally speaking wouldn't recommend starting on a super fast bike, I do have to say that with the rider aids and things like that they've put into the newer bikes, it makes those bikes a lot more approachable for someone who is new, who doesn't want to have to continually upgrade over time. That said, me personally, I believe that starting on smaller bikes and then learning how to really push them fast has taught me a little bit more about how to push a fast bike faster. It gave me a little bit more confidence in the actual skills needed to shave off those little bits and pieces here and there that now make big differences on a faster motorcycle. On top of the confidence, you also really want to consider your traffic pattern knowledge. So a lot of people I see just truly don't understand how to read traffic, how to see traffic, and that's where you see a lot of these bikers knocking off mirrors, getting frustrated with cars because realistically they just didn't read situations well, chose to put themselves in the middle of it, or didn't notice that they were about to be in the middle of it, and thus got frustrated when people didn't act accordingly. Riding should always be something where you are expecting them to do the worst of the worst, and you ride with the intent to be able to avoid those situations wherever possible. There's a lot of different things you should be thinking about while you're riding a motorcycle, and if you're not the type of person who's doing that while driving a car and believing that you're just going to pick up on a motorcycle and just start doing those things, that's a whole separate skill that you're going to have to learn. On top of that, look into your physical attributes. Depending on the size of person you are, that'll dictate what type of motorcycle you really want to get started with. Something with 2 cylinders is going to have a lot more torque than something with 4. And if you're a lot larger rider and you're riding around town, you're going to want the torque over the power because realistically you don't have the space to wring out that bike. So depending on the application, depending on the rider's size, and depending on their ability to be nimble, will kind of dictate which bike they really want to get into. It's great to think you want to be a super sport rider until you sit on the bike and you realize how much work is actually involved physically to make that bike maneuver the way that you would really want it to maneuver. The next thing to really consider would be your future bike goals. So if your goal is to ride a super sport, it doesn't really make any sense to just start off riding a cruiser. It's not to say that you wouldn't learn the skills and be able to apply them, but you ought to at least start with something that makes sense for your long-term goals of where you want to be as a rider. And the next thing is going to come down to a lot of personal preference. So with personal preference, if you're not into one type of ride or you really don't like one type of bike or another, that's fine. Pick whichever one you really like and whichever one you're confident with. All I'm saying is to stick within a bike that makes sense for a new rider, to also ensure that you're able to progress yourself and don't immediately want to upgrade or don't immediately just want to switch up the style of motorcycle that you picked. So what I think new riders really should take a look at when they're looking at a new motorcycle is something that they can be comfortable in for long enough to be able to get the saddle time to be able to ride well enough to upgrade. A lot of people get into these bikes, they don't put that many miles onto them, but they feel like they've had them for a while, so they're ready to upgrade. It's not necessarily about the miles you put on the bike or the hours you spend in the saddle, but more so the amount of time you spend actually practicing within the saddle, progressing your skills. I personally believe that there's a certain middle ground between a powerful enough bike to grow into and also a bike that you can push your skill set on. Some of the options that I personally like for new riders, if you're really into the naked bikes, I would look at the MT-07, the MT-03. It's going to be a 3 versus 700s. Similar to the Z400, Z650, the Ninja 650, the Ninja 400. If you're into the cruiser type, check out the Rebel 500, the Rebel 300 if you want something a little bit lighter. Personally, I'd start with the 500. I recommend starting anywhere between the 400 and 650 range, sometimes even pushing up to the 700. Like I would recommend the R7 for a new rider as well. The DRZ 400, the SV 650 are another great options as well. BMW, any one of the G310 motorcycles would be great options for new riders. Me personally, I started on a Ninja 650. I found it to be a perfect beginner bike for me. I did have some experience with fast cars. I am also a relatively in shape person who's nimble. I do not regret that bike at all. A lot of my buddies had cruisers, a lot of my buddies had sport bikes. It kind of allowed me to have that middle ground where I could go for long rides with the cruisers, but I could kind of push a little bit with the sport bikes. Back roads, I learned how to really push that bike fast. It was a great bike to learn on. I still miss it as a daily rider to this day, to be honest with you. Everything on it was very straightforward. It wasn't overly heavy. I will say that when you're looking at buying a new bike, to just expect that if you're going to buy a new bike as a new rider, that new bike is not going to remain beautiful for very long. I brought that bike home, made it all the way home. The very next morning I dropped it while trying to push it. About 3 or 4 days later, I was pulling into my driveway. There's a little speed bump at the front of it, hit the bump, lost control, sent it into a bush. The fairings on the one side were scratched on it, and from that point forward, I just decided I was going to dive further into actually learning how to really ride the bike and not worry about those little scratches here and there. And I'd upgrade when I was ready, which is exactly what I did. The other aspect of the Ninja 650 that I personally really liked was that it was something that inspired confidence in me while I was riding it. It was very, very confident on the highways, it was very confident around town. And overall, it just was a very straightforward, approachable motorcycle to learn on, while also providing with enough power to make you realize that you had to be careful. It was perfect for 2-up riding. The 2 cylinders had enough torque to really get us going. My girl really enjoyed learning how to ride a motorcycle with me. And the last part being that it was a recognizable name. People hear you have a Ninja, they know what it is. These are just some of the examples of some of the bikes I would recommend and what I personally tell people to look for in a bike when they're actually getting started. Hopefully this cleared up any questions you might have if you were looking to get a first bike and the types of bikes that there are and some of the benefits of them. If you have a bike that you're questioning or you're taking a look at or you're interested in a certain bike and you just want to shoot a question off about it, feel free to leave so down in the comments and I'll gladly respond to anybody who posts down there. Thanks guys, hope you have a great day.